happened among European immigrants, though? Do we have a short memory in terms of the historical framework? Because certainly there was pushback against Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants at various points as well.
Yes, there absolutely was. And the immigration legislation, racially restrictive immigration legislation started after the Civil War, precisely to address this problem in the eyes of Congress that people of color were now going to be able to obtain citizenship by being physically present and then having children who would become citizens by birth. And so there was a very strong push to racially restrict immigration in order to maintain the whiteness of the country. And that started with the restrictions against Asians, Chinese, Japanese, and then all Asians. And Asia was defined as a very large territory, about 3/4 of the world's territory. And then it was extended even to those Europeans who were considered to be not quite white enough. So their immigration was never stopped entirely. People like the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, the Poles, the sort of not white enough Europeans, but it was drastically cut back also in the starting in 1917 and through the 1920s.
In a contemporary sense, when we have dealt with the issue of immigration in the past, particularly in the 80s, it doesn't seem like it was with the same degree, the same fervor that we're seeing today. Many of the issues were the same. The attitudes were different. Talk a little about that.
Well, I think we do see something similar to the fervor we're seeing today, but it was in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, but it was always expressed in explicitly racial terms. That is, the invasion of the Chinese who are going to take over the territory and who are inadequate citizens because of their race. The attitudes are so extremely racialized. That is, these Central American children, and even the term of illegality that's applied to so many of the immigrants that are crossing the border is an extraordinarily racialized term that has almost come to replace race, because it's not legitimate to openly discriminate on the basis of race anymore. But if we replace race with legal status, suddenly it becomes legitimate to openly discriminate and to rail against people because of this category that they're put into, which we no longer call a racial category. Now we call it a category of legal status. The
idea of illegal immigration, one of the things you talk about in Undocumented is that the whole phrase itself, the idea of it, is a relatively recent phenomenon. Talk a little bit about that, Aviva.
Yes, and that connects to what I was mentioning earlier, that really until the 1960s, the animus against immigrants was very openly and explicitly a racial animus. That is, we don't want these people because of their race, was the way it was expressed, both in the laws and in popular sentiment. But there were some changes in the laws in the 1960s that really created this category of illegal immigration from the 1960s into the present. And if you look back, say, in the 1950s, when large numbers of say, Operation Wetback, when large numbers of Mexicans and Mexican Americans were expelled from the country, it wasn't precisely on the basis of illegality. It was on the basis of race, of Mexican being considered a race. We don't want these Mexicans in the country. And so people who were U.S. citizens of Mexican origin were expelled, along with people of varying different immigration statuses. But the laws bringing Mexicans into the country as workers, that is, interestingly enough, all of the immigration restrictions that were passed in the 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Asiatic Barred Zone, the numeric restrictions on Southern and Eastern Europeans, Mexicans were never restricted during that whole 100 years of laws restricting immigration from, say, 1865 to 1965. There were no restrictions placed on Mexican immigration. Mexicans were crossing the border in large numbers, primarily as seasonal workers, mostly recruited by U.S. employers and brought in on U.S.-built railroads that were built specifically to bring them here. And from 1942 till 1964, through the Bracero program, a U.S. government-sponsored program explicitly set up with the Mexican government to bring in huge numbers of Mexicans as guest workers. So during that whole time until 1965, there were no restrictions on Mexicans crossing the border into the United States because they were not considered immigrants, because immigrants were people who were coming to stay, and Mexicans were considered to be workers, not people who were coming to stay. So in the civil rights climate of the 1960s, two really important things happened that tried to start treating Mexicans like all other people in the world as potential immigrants when they crossed the border. One is that the Bracero program was ended, and there had been a lot of political mobilizing against the Bracero program for its exploitative nature and its the way it undermined labor organizing in the fields and the status of farm workers, whatever their status as workers, whatever their legal or immigration status, because of this guest worker program. That was abolished in 1964, and at practically the same time in 1965, a new massive overhaul of the immigration laws were passed that did away with all of the prohibitions, racial prohibitions on immigration, and set up a uniform quota system so that every country of the world had a uniform quota. Now, the rationale behind this was to de-racialize the system and to treat all people equally. But what it did is for the first time put numerical restrictions on Mexican migrants into the United States, so that people who had been crossing the border for decades, even for generations, to work in the U.S., suddenly all of their legal routes to do this were cut off. And yet their need to work and the need of employers to employ them remained, so that the Bracero program was essentially replaced by a massive system of so-called illegal immigration. Nonetheless, that so-called illegal immigration was not, nobody tried to stop it or prosecute it in any way until the 1980s. That is, people were crossing the border illegally in large numbers to work. People who had previously been doing that legally were now doing it illegally, but there was really no system at the border to try to stop them from doing it, and there was no internal system to stop them from doing it. That doesn't come about until the late 1980s, early 1990s, when this true illegalizing of immigration and the idea that illegal immigration should be punished and that the border needs to be controlled starts to take over. And this is where I see is the real sort of re-racialization of undocumentedness, turning undocumented status into something to be punished.